Okay. Welcome everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depends on where you are. Welcome to our third webinar in a series of webinars on cultural preservation, preservation of political heritage and culture in Palestine and among the Palestinians. We had two webinars, one on preserving the audiovisual heritage of the Palestinians, the second one on museums, and this event is on two archival initiatives out of many. And we have distinguished guest speakers today. Professor Karman Nabulsi from Oxford University and Professor Abdelrazak Takriti from Houston University. Both are co-authors and curators of the Palestinian Revolution website. It's a bilingual a website that provides a historical survey and of Palestinian political practice and thought from the Nakba until the siege of Beirut from 1948 until 1882. They will have about 25 minutes to 30 minutes to present their project. And then we will move to a second archival initiative on the Golan Heights called Mapping Memories of Resistance. And we have our guest today is Mona Dajani, Dr. Mona Dajani, who will present the project. She initiated this this work, and it's a cooperation, collaborative project between LSE and Birzeit University. In my capacity as a researcher at the Institute for Palestine Studies, I'll be moderating this event, but I'm also partner with Mona Dajani on the Golan project. So I'll have some thoughts to share with you on that, in addition to the moderation of this event. After our speakers present their work, we will have a discussion. We'll collect questions from the audience, and we'll open the discussion for everyone. So now, without further ado, I'll give the word to Professor Karman Nabulsi and then Professor Abdelrazak Takriti. Please, it's your
Thank you, Munir.
stage.
Thank you, Munir, and thank you to the Institute, and thank you to Laura, and thank you for Mona for doing this seminar with us. It's such a lovely idea, and really looking forward to the questions. I'm just going to introduce our research program and going to hand it over to Abdelrazak, who's going to take us through it a little bit. It's a labor of some pedagogy, I wouldn't say of love, but of course there was a lot of love in it, but there was a lot of hard work over many, many years to get there. So I would encourage everyone to look at the website and take their time to look at the two sections of it, which Abed will cover, but also the About Us, which I'm just going to introduce, because as with this experience and this history and its task, this research and this resources, it relies on a context which was internationalist, and we relied on a number of institutions in really following different continents and involving them, different institutions of research, museums, along with a host of scholars and protagonists of the Palestinian Revolution who were really extraordinary in their contributions and designed their own participation. And I hope, Abid, if we can look at the cadres as well, because that's another section we didn't even talk about covering today. But I leave it up to you for whatever 15, 20 minutes, and I hand over. Abid was working on this with me when he was finishing his doctorate at Oxford, and he stayed on. We were very lucky to keep him for a little bit as a research fellow, and carried out the interviews, carried out many of the design of this intellectual design and arguments within it. And we co-wrote this together, co-curated even, I think, besides co-edited. So there's no one better really to take us through this magnificent collective work. Abid.
Yeah, thank you, Karma, and thank you, Munir, thank you, Muna. It's good to start with the purposes that underlie this project. And I think initially, when Karma and I were thinking about doing something along these lines, we were not thinking of creating an archive. We were thinking of developing a set of resources to address challenges that were faced by educators who are trying to understand modern Palestinian history. There's a set of parameters that prevented people from approaching this history in an open way, particularly when it came to the question of the Palestinian Revolution. The very term revolution was difficult to use in the Western Academy at the time when we started talking about this subject. And certainly in the Palestinian and Arab Academy, it was also largely avoided. In many Arab countries, there was a history of a contradiction between the Palestinian struggle and its structures and the existing states and regimes, which meant that it's difficult to talk of the revolutionary aspects of that struggle. You can talk about the Palestinian cause, al-Qadiyya al-Palestiniya, in the abstract, but to talk of the attempt of its people to organize, mobilize, and develop their own independent vision and structures around organization and mobilization was very, very highly suppressed in those settings, to say the least. And that had to do with regime legitimation purposes, as well as the complex histories in each individual Arab country. In the Western Academy, we have the struggle confronting all anti-colonial movements because anti-colonialism was historically criminalized. And in this regard, actually, for the theory of it, I would highly recommend that you check Karma's beautiful book on traditions of war, which is really about how different visions of war started in the 18th and 19th centuries, and how we have the whole intellectual order of viewing different struggles, developing in a way that is not friendly, to say the least, to people trying to gain their freedom, especially within the imperial context. The dominant ways of approaching these struggles is a way that attempts to marginalize them. The dominant theories are ones that favor imperial armies and colonial countries. So Palestine was not an exception to that. Like the South Africans and like the Algerians and like many other oppressed peoples, we were confronted with a task, very difficult task, of explaining what does it mean to be engaged in a revolution for freedom in a Western atmosphere that was very much complicit in shackling our people and in colonizing them. So how to approach this in a way that dealt with the severe repression of Palestinian history and memory in both the Arab settings and in the Western settings, and to deal with the also the erasure of the memories of the Bandung tradition and the tricontinental tradition, of which the Palestinian Revolution was a part, because there's also that whole tricontinental world of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, in which there was a very strong affiliation with the Palestinian struggle, of course, historically. But as the historical distance grows, something in the collective memory is retained, but it's not manifest. It's more latent. So how to awaken that, how to recall that, how to retrieve that was a big challenge as well. And when we started the project, we wanted to actually think of it in a global context, which is why we worked very closely. And maybe Karma can say a word about that later on, with sister projects that tried to address these questions in places like South Africa and Cuba. You know, they had different ways of doing it. But for Palestine, we felt that we needed to rely very much on online technologies because of the dispersal of our people, because of the fact that we're refugee people that is still not able to go back to its homeland, because our young people have a right to access their history no matter where they live. And we had to be very attentive to the need to provide a platform that is very accessible to people regardless of where they live, but also that reflects their different subjective realities, because that's another added layer of complexity to the Palestinian cause. Anybody who's done research on this, and certainly Karma had taught me this back in the days when you know, I was a student, is that when you're dealing with something like the Palestinian people, the political fragmentation can sometimes reflect itself in the fragmentation of historical memory. So I learned a lot from her about the struggle against fragmentation. And this was an enormous aspect of this website, that we have to try to find a way to tell the story, not from the prism just of the Palestinians in Lebanon, or the Palestinians in Jordan, or the Palestinians in Syria, and certainly not just from the prism of the Palestinians in the 48 or the occupied territories. It has to be a story that's told on multiple layers, multiple levels, and that reflects these complex realities. Because depending on where you grew up, you might know a lot about what went on in your area, but there's a good chance that you'll forget about what was happening in Lebanon. And we saw this as we were doing our research, because when you look at anti-colonial movements, they're usually clandestine. People sometimes don't even know the names of their comrades in struggle, let alone their backgrounds. There's a lot of work that was happening in different parts of the world that people were not aware of in other parts of the world. And certainly what's really fascinating about something like the Palestinian struggle was how international and how widespread it was across the global map. This is another dimension that we try to cover here. We wanted to really account for the different solidarities and global interconnections, but also the different ways in which Palestinian communities coordinated with each other and Palestinian cadres coordinated with each other across the global map. So we had different layers that we tried to account for as we were telling that story. Now, another dimension that we were trying to think of here, and really, again, like, and I'm sure we can talk more about it if we have some questions and answers. But one of the things that we had to deal with was the very methodology around the notion of an archive. In many ways, that's an imperial notion. That's an established state notion. It's really, archives play a bureaucratic function, generally speaking. They come out of stability. They come out of stillness. When the Rankian tradition in history, methodologically, you know, von Ranke started the kind of very high positivist empiricist way to approach history. He started from the Vatican archives, for example. It's a place that's been around for hundreds of years. It's very steady. It's very stable. It's highly protected. And that means that there's an accumulation of material there. When you look at the British Imperial Archives or the French archives, these are very stable states that have not had their sovereignty violated, even when they were invaded temporarily, you know, in the case of the Second World War in France. It was very temporary. A lot of the documents survived. The bureaucratic tradition around them survived. But we don't have that. We're a colonized people. We're revolutionary people. And revolutionary peoples tend to destroy documents. They don't tend to preserve them because they're always running away from regimes. They're always subjected to warfare. And the classic example is the assault on for example, the Palestinian Research Centre in Beirut. We're also a people that passed through a phase in the 1990s and the 2000s. And in a sense, this was a context out of which our project emerged. We passed through a phase when we were pretending that we're not a revolutionary people and that we're engaged in a state building project. So there was this whole fantasy going on of let's institution, let's archive, let's create all these very still institutions that are connected to actually stable statehood. In a context when actually what we needed was the complete opposite. We needed fluidity. We needed accessibility in a different way. Yeah. And accessibility was key, therefore, to the methodology that we developed, which is really, in that sense, an anti-archival methodology. You didn't have to register here to come to this archive. You didn't have to go to a physical building. It's not really an archive. We thought of it more as a curated collection because we wanted to emphasize, by the way, we could have easily digitized all the stuff out there and just put it out. But then how does that serve the pedagogical purpose? What was more interesting for us was to tell a story of a very, very big history that is impossible to actually reduce to an archive, and to show through using a limited range of materials. You know, we have a lot of materials in the website. It's like, you know, in the thousands, the amount of, if you count interviews and documents and website, you know, all the translations and all that, there's a lot. It's a huge amount. But actually what we were trying to say is, no matter how much you put, you're not telling the story. What is more interesting is to feel it, sense it, and how are we going to go through that journey of sensing it and sampling it in that way. So that was the pedagogical concern here. And it was to open up the spaces for further research through giving people a sense of what beautiful treasures are out there in this, when it comes to this subject. So, you know, we did a lot of interviews, a lot. And if you look at the section, I don't know, Laura, if you can share the screen for the website, is that possible?
Yeah, give me a minute.
Yeah, so now as you'll see, like once the screen is shared, we developed 3 different layers for telling the story. One was a curricular exercise which is Teach the Revolution. If you press on that, Laura, that would be great. Yeah, and here, the Teach the Revolution, the idea behind it was to offer people, educators, particularly at the university level, both undergraduate and graduate, because people can select how much difficulty and how much material they want to use in this. But we wanted to afford them the opportunity to hear the story of the revolution through its own documents, which is a different exercise than the traditional, way of teaching, which is let's assign the secondary books on the subject, for example. There are, of course, secondary books on the subject, but they generally treat it in ways that reflect the particular moments they were written in ways that reflect particular visions and methodologies. But what the students desperately lacked was the ability to actually hear the voices from that period, read the writings from that period. And we tried in this curriculum to provide 12 weeks that are thematically organized. And you can see the themes on the right of the screen. Each week handling a particular theme through the documents of the revolution. Of course, Karma and I wrote essays for each week that brought together the documents, contextualized them, gave people a sense of the world out of which they came. But the documents, each document was used to illustrate a certain theme. Now, we had to be very attentive to including all sorts of voices in these documents. Of course, we were very attentive to questions of gender. We were very attentive to questions of class. These are the immediate questions that come to a historian when they're trying to deal with something like this. But there were other questions that have to do specifically with anti-colonial context that we also had to be attentive to. In particular, the fact that anti-colonial struggles tend to be struggles that bring about huge sectors of any particular people. There's so many people involved in it. And in the case of the Palestinian Revolution, there was a great deal of ideological and political pluralism in the struggle. There were all sorts of movements and parties, and you can tell a party story very easily if you're not very careful. You can end up telling the story of the PFLP, for example, or the story of the Communist Party, or the story of Fatah, or the story of the DFLP. But we didn't want to tell a party narrative here. What we wanted to show was actually that there were many party narratives, but they all fed into the bigger picture, which is that of the revolution as a whole. So we had to be careful about that dimension. We had to be careful about the regional dimension. In the week, the Nakba generation, for example, you can't tell the story of the Nakba generation through just selecting a random sample of people who lived through the Nakba through their writings. You had to think of what the Nakba meant in the Jalil, in the Galilee, what the Nakba meant in Gaza, what the Nakba meant in different parts of Palestine. And what you see then is that the political trajectories that were connected to those areas also, were connected to this local experience, but there were common themes that tied them all together. So, if you look, and also these narratives, we tried very hard to not just tell the story of leaderships. The top tier leaders were always included. In the bit that Laura selected here, for example, we have, top tier leaders like Abu Iyad and George Habash reflecting on their experiences in the Nakba. But then you go and you find middle cadres and you find lower cadres from different parts. We used Abu Iyad to talk a little bit about what was going on in Yafa, Habash to talk about what was going on in Lid. But then in the village of Hamama, we used an account that's very local from the kind of village histories that appeared later on and that talk about people that nobody has ever heard of. Same with the village of Salem, same with Tarshih. So that gives you a sense of the richness of the story and the different angles that were in it. I'm not going to talk, by the way, for too long because I know we have so much to cover and we can do all of that in the question and answers. So one thing that Laura, you might want to help me with is to go back to the front page and beyond the curriculum, which I hope I gave you a sense of it, we have the Learn the Revolution. The Teach the Revolution is meant to be a teaching aid for professors, for students, and even for autodidacts, the ones who want to teach themselves about this history. And it's very structured. Here we had Learn the Revolution, which we thought of more as a gallery to engage with different themes. Imagine yourself going to any gallery or any exhibition. Let's say you're going to a gallery focusing on Impressionism. They're not going to show you every Impressionist painting in the world. What they will show you is, paintings that reflect certain moments in Impressionism, certain themes in it, and that way you get the sense of the richness of the movement. And should you wish to take it further, of course, you can go to other galleries, you can do your own research into it, you can do all of that. And we tried here to do just that. That's why we call it co-curating, Karma and I, because really this had a curatorial dimension, as well as, of course, having a methodological dimension of how to frame certain issues. So the revolutionary, we did it into 3 different sections or 3 different galleries, if you will, but whatever you want to call it. Revolutionary movements. And revolutionary movements had 3 themes in it, which is founding, joining, and mobilizing. There, the idea is to give you a journey through what does it mean to start something like a revolutionary movement. What does it mean to then join that sort of thing? And what does it mean to engage in mobilizing and expanding and bringing people into that? So that's one way of telling the story of the Palestinian Revolution through a focus on its movements. Another way of telling the story of the revolution is to look at moments, historical moments. And here we were, very much, the agenda was shaped by Karma long before I even started studying at university, because she had been doing that work on a theoretical level when it came to revolutionary movements. And part of her theoretical intervention was to emphasize that revolutions are not just about the milestones, the big moments, the Karame battle, the 67 war, this and that. They're actually about the moments in between. That focus on the moments in between was very much part of what we're trying to do here, without, of course, ignoring the milestones. Because the craft of revolution gets developed in those moments. And the hard work that goes into building the infrastructure for revolution takes place actually long before the milestones and the big events. Something like the first Intifada, often people think, oh, it just happened. and of course it had elements of spontaneity, but of course it didn't happen in a society that was not highly politicized, or that didn't have movements and political organizations that have been working for decades. Didn't have cadres and former prisoners and people who had developed the craft of organizing, that knew how to write a communique, that knew how to organize a demonstration, that knew how to combat prison interrogation. So that infrastructure, that set of connections, we tried to look at both within Palestine, both in the Dual al-Thought, the countries surrounding Palestine, which were at the front lines, of the struggle for Palestine, and then of course on the global stage through the section Revolution in the world, where we were looking really at solidarity in different aspects and manifestations. Finally, we had revolutionary culture, and really one of the things that you notice in much of the literature is an obsession with the military and the diplomatic and all of these aspects. What we're trying to do here was to actually remind people that there's much more to revolution than that, and certainly to the Palestinian Revolution. This was a huge civic endeavor with so many layers to that. And it was also an enormous cultural production endeavor. It was a space for epistemological contestation and epistemological anti-colonialism. So there's so much that went into that. And we tried to give people a sense of that here and Learn the Revolution. Now, finally, last but not least, Laura, if you can go back to the front page, and I promise that'll be the last bit that I'm going to talk about. We have cadres. If you press on the cadres, we felt it's very important for people to actually recall and interact and hear the Palestinian cadres that participated in the struggle from different levels of leadership, from different backgrounds, and both party backgrounds, regional backgrounds, gender backgrounds, class background, to give a sense of how rich this experience was. So in the cadre section, there's all sorts of discussions about methodology of how to conduct oral history in these settings. And we can talk more about that later. And by the way, we did a lot of workshops to try to figure that out and think it through. And there were great people that were involved in that. But if you go further down, Laura, you will see that on the website itself, we provided samples of some of the interviews that we did. These are just some sample clips. But then we also provided a link to a YouTube channel, which is Learn Palestine, that has a much larger selection of interviews. And like the written sources that we have, like the documents and pamphlets and communiques and so on and so forth that we provided in the other sections, these interviews are meant to be open source. People are meant to access them. We want researchers to use them. We wanted to try to do something which is to break this model of like, the material is gathered for the personal use of the researcher. I mean, some of you might know, Karma and I, we're very much engaged in research around this that's directed towards our own personal writings. However, we didn't want to, fall into the trap of thinking, okay, we're just going to collect this material and use it for ourselves. It's actually much more empowering to just share it, put it all out there. And that actually captures the collective spirit of sharing that was there in the moment that we're talking about. It reflects the epistemology that was developed by Palestinian structures at the time, and the pedagogical practice that was developed by them at the time, and the research practice that was developed at the time, which is the research is done there for the service of disseminating knowledge. So any material I collect or you collect or anybody collects can be interpreted in different ways by different researchers. The way Karma and I will look at this material is going to be different than how it's looked at by other people. There's always different angles, different visions, different ways of seeing. But the point is, let the material be out there. Let people have access to it. And then we will have a greater amount of richness in how we tell those stories.
But if I could...
Karma might come in at this stage.
Well, I'll just to close, because I know there'll be questions about this, but just this point, which is so important, was our work with the cadres, who many of them had never spoken about this history. And because of the Palestinian Revolution and the experience of a people that were disenfranchised who made their own history, many of it was in people's own memory and not written down. And it belongs, we had many conversations, or there was a process of being able to talk about this experience, which is secret, which is privilege, which is also a collective history or a collective experience. And the cadres were very involved in the design of that, because the purpose was to pass it to the next generation. There was a deep understanding that this doesn't belong to us. Those who had participated in many things and knew a lot of history, but it was in their heads, but that this was something that belonged to the Palestinian people and was done for, etc. So in the design of those long interviews, of which a fraction are on both the YouTube or the ones that we subtitled some clips of them, the more was there working to that set of principles about this history, which was this, how we made it, all the Palestinian people, but also those who were responsible in certain ways, who needed to transmit that and convey that when we are still without, outside of the homeland and without those national institutions that can play that role. So Abed's nodding. There's so many more things we can do, but I'm mindful of the time. And we've done 30 minutes. So I kind of think Munir and Mona, you're going to talk about this wonderful research that's underway, but building. And I think you have documents also to show. And I think there's some questions that Laura is already gathering for us. Is that right?
Yes. Well, thank you very much, both Karma and Abed, for a wonderful, rich presentation and an amazing piece of work. This is really something to learn from a lot. I visited the website and I saw how the immense potential in using it. I maybe delay my remarks for after Muna's presentation.
Sure.
To stick with the plan. But thank you really, and thanks to Laura Albast for her technical support. She's not on screen, but she's doing the great work behind the scene. So Muna, please, it's your stage now.
Thank you, Munir, and thank you, Karma and Abed, for presentation. I'm really, it's a privilege and an honor to share, this platform with all of you. I'm really thankful to IPS also for allowing us to speak about these great initiatives. And as Munir said, there's so much interest nowadays in archiving projects, but it's really nice to kind of talk to each other. And I have to say also, when this proposal for this project was in in preparation, one of the inspiration for it was your archive. Definitely, it's there in the proposal. So it's really great. I'm really excited to be here. I just have a few comments to share, and just being mindful of the time. Hopefully, in the discussion, we'll be able to expand more. And as Karma mentioned, our project is still underway. The website is under construction, and it's still going through like a lot of exciting developments with the design of it. We're really looking forward to it. I would share maybe just a preliminary background so that we can see it while I speak. And our project, as Munir mentioned, he's a co-principal investigator on the project from Birzeit, and Michael Mason is the co-principal investigator from LSE Middle East Centre. And we're also working in collaboration with Al-Marsad, which is the Arab human rights organization that has been working for decades in the Golan Heights. So this project came about because we, as researchers, as academics, keep thinking about and describing the occupied Syrian Golan Heights as a case of a forgotten occupation. That is really the case because if we look at the occupied Golan Heights, we hear about it in academic literature, in scholarship work, as a case of geostrategic importance. Maybe IR, international relations, security studies will actually emphasize, the importance of the Golan Heights on a geostrategic level. But what we have missing is the really focus on the story of how the Golan Heights came to be occupied, what happened to the populations, hundreds of thousands of people who were displaced, hundreds of villages and towns that were destroyed, a complete transformation of the Golan Heights as a region, and its transformation of its landscape. As we know, settler colonialism is, yes, the wolf quotation is coming. It's a structure, not an event. And in the settler colonial imaginary, the Golan Heights has always been perceived and described as this open frontier for Israeli control, for control of resources, for developing new settlements, for really harnessing all of the natural resources of the region, and that continues until this day. What we propose in this project is to, of course, think of also the points, as Abed also mentioned, these important events and important milestones in community struggles, as important as they are as events that need to be studied, scrutinized, and looked at critically. We also need to look at them as structures. So what we do in our project, we kind of center the Jawlani or the Golan Heights experience. We center the Jawlani experience around 1967, but most importantly around 1982, which has been the epitome of Jawlani struggle against, first of all, the Israeli unilateral annexation law, and exercising that by extending its control over the territory. And also, of course, the big general strike that happened in 1982 that changed and transformed the Jawlani society completely. We look at the ramifications and the impact of that transformation on this day on the community, and how this community still engages with questions of identity, belonging, access to their natural resources, and continuous struggles on political economy level and other struggles they face under capitalist regimes. So for us, the project really aimed to historicize and politicize these events, not thinking of them again as events per se. So our attempt is not to collect material or archives from different places and put them in one place, but rather to historicize and politicize these events. And look at them in light of what we know today. So we look at the past knowing how to also deal with the future. I think that is really an important point, because a lot, again, as Abed mentioned, that when we think of archives in their kind of state-centric or state-led endeavors, we don't attempt to replicate that at all. We actually look at our project as a project to that goes or that employs an approach of social history, or from history from below. So really allowing for archiving to be alive and dynamic process that involves intergenerational dialogue and conversation, rather than just focusing on events that happened in, let's say, the decades in the 1980s in this instant, and forgetting that the younger generations have not experienced them the same way as those generations have experienced them. So we really focus here on a variety of raw materials and conversations with community initiatives, with political activists, with local archives that have been going on for decades in the Jolan. It's really a great collective endeavor that happened, where people started collecting their own archives, because again, in this case, the lack of state structure motivated Jolanis to do their own work on multiple levels, not only in archiving, but in collective action of reclaiming rights to resources and water, to protecting lands against confiscation, identity, protecting their identity against decades of Israelification, and multiple other fields. So this is where our project is trying to build on that experience, and reflect on how the everyday aspects of lives have been transformed because of and as part of this process and structural change in society from the 1980s. The 1980s also, this intifada, or this uprising, was also against Israeli attempt to enforce and coerce the Jolanis to accept Israeli citizenship and Israeli to accept identity cards, which the Jolanis have collectively agreed during that 6-month strike to refuse to accept this. So they would throw the identity cards in the middle of a square here. And that is one of the images that, of course, stuck until today with younger generation, older generations, whoever really knew the impact of what that had an impact on people until today. So for our project, that is really important. An important point is for us is this intergenerational archiving. And how can we actually do that? How can we speak of archives not in its historical sense, but also think of it as a live process? And our project really engaged students from Birzeit University and students from the Golan Heights, and also renowned also political activists who were part of this uprising and part of these demonstrations. And we having a dialogue about these events and how do we look at them today. As you can imagine, after decades of settler colonial rule, in addition to the Syrian Revolution in 2011 and the war that happened, still happening until today, these identity questions still are very important questions for the Jolanis. So reflecting on those events, especially for the young generation, is met with a lot of tension and a lot of kind of speculation. And So it's not always, with this nostalgic way that maybe older generations look at it. Maybe Abed has referred to that a bit. And I think it's really important to not think of these events as a romanticized events. I think this is also something we have encountered in our work, where also the Palestinian imaginary of the occupied Golan Heights and the mobilizations that have happened in the 80s was really important, where also our students also were reflecting and kind of debating also perceived notions about these revolutions. And I think this is really an important thing to keep in mind, where archives really, they're still alive, they're still there. Another thing that I wanted to really, I might stop my screen just to, I'll come back to it just because I have some notes. Another thing that, sorry. Yes. So these acts of solidarity that we're really interested in, and I think that's how also the Palestinian struggle title of this talk really comes it's really on point, because also kind of the separation of struggles is, as we know, is something that's not really realistic, because struggles are really shaped and co-shaped by other struggles happening, whether in close geographical proximity, like the occupied Golan and Palestine, but also wider beyond geography, collaborations, mobilization, and solidarity. And I think it's really of really importance to look at these decades that we look at, which is the 1980s specifically, as the decades of revolutions, of the first Intifada, and actually the Jawlani 6-month strike preceded the Intifada. So it happened in 1982, and it happened around the same time. And what we also come to see and come to realize from our kind of discussions, from reading testimonies and hearing accounts of people who were engaged in that part, about the tremendous amount of solidarity that happened there, starting from 1967, of course, with the Israeli occupation, which allowed at the end people could meet each other, and they exchange, advice, legal advice on how to protect land from confiscation, for instance, or how to make sure that to carry out certain, let's say, agricultural practices to allow people to maintain rights of ownership to their lands, which the Palestinians, especially under military rule inside 1948, had to pay a hefty price for. So these kind of acts of solidarity and mobilization come to the surface again by exploring these archives. During the Intifada as well, a lot of Jawlani groups, a lot of community members also joined the Intifada acts and actions in the West Bank. Same with when the Jawlani strike happened, there was a lot of solidarity campaigns, a lot of support, because again, in the 6 months also there was a siege against these Jawlani communities. So the a lot of Palestinian groups from 1948 from the West Bank and Gaza came to the rescue. We also looked at, the prison experience. How do actually political prisoners that come from the Golan Heights and from Palestine have also shared, experiences inside the prison that are still very strongly exercised until this day. We look at commerce and how also Palestinian merchants supported, the marketing of Jawlani apples in the West Bank and Gaza markets. So a lot of things came to be unearthed, making us realize also that struggles are not separate; they're not separable from each other. There are actually so much synergy, so much dynamics that happen there that are happening until today. However, today, when we think about reflect about these events and this solidarity, what we also engaging with the students really made us realize how, you know, that kind of support or that mobilization has stayed in the realm of that generation, while today's generation still struggles to make sense of what's happening in the occupied Golan Heights, or actually to learn about it. So it was interesting to hear from them about, you know, that experience of like, how can we actually rekindle those solidarity acts under the conditions we live under today, after decades of settler colonial rule. So it's also an interesting way to provide a platform for these kind of deliberations and discussions and debates. This brings me back, or brings me to the last point of, you know, our platform, our website that we're developing, and the fact that we look at it as a platform for knowledge exchange, for critical decolonial knowledge production. We look at the community archives as our source where we start our work, and we reflect on it with students' reflections and writings through podcasts and interviews with figures and prominent figures in the Golan Heights. We look at it through, you know, using counter mapping. So the idea of using the map to actually engage critically and understand critically ontological, but also epistemological realities, and really kind of providing a platform for more and more collaborations. So it will be an alive and lively platform. It won't just have material there, but it will be a place for interaction and dynamics. And the most another deliverable that we're looking at, that we are working on developing, is the curriculum, which is also, again, not going to be the traditional curriculum of readings to understand, you know, what happened in the Golan Heights, but how can we study the Golan Heights in an emancipatory manner, and in a way that actually challenges status quo, and creates, you know, and allows for critical voices to come about that don't only necessarily come from Western academia, but also can come from within and from the bottoms up. So I'll stop here and maybe allow for more discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you, Muna, very much for this wonderful presentation. We do have some important questions, I think, that were, I'm not sure if Abed and Karma have read those questions, or we should ask for Laura's help. But before that, I'll just, more questions are coming in also, I think. But I want to just relate a few ideas. I think Abed's presentation, Abed mentioned a few key points. One is on the notion of revolution, which and the way in which it was received by Arab regimes. I think this is still a present and a future issue. So we have to think and defend the meaning of a revolution. What does it mean really in this? And I think the counter-revolutionary discourse will be greater in the coming years, and especially today in some of these regimes. This is one I think one issue, one aspect of this project that is highly valuable. That it forces us to relate the. I mean, I think many people don't know about the culture of revolutions and the global and historical context of these things, and the epistemological context of revolutions. So your contribution is really great. In my experience, at Birzeit University, we in the heart of the occupation, right? We often find ourselves obliged to teach the Western canon rather than the revolutionary traditions. So when I teach my students or speak about Locke, I have to go off the text to tell about history. And when I speak about the French Revolution, I also have to go to the Saint-Dominique Revolution. But it's not in the text, right? It's so I think what you're initiating here is profound and very important, and has to be, and it's so current, I think, for the Palestinian, the new generation, let's say, the academia, because in the dominant project in Palestine is this state building project, which is not inclusive and it's not revolutionary. It tends to have, it's myopic towards the past in many serious ways. And that reflects itself in the education system and in the academia. So I visit your website, and I have to struggle how to use it in the teaching process. I think it depends on what you teach, of course, but this is one issue you shouldn't forget. This is a current. The pedagogical impact of this project could be great. It should be embraced by many scholars teaching in Palestine, not also abroad. The fragmentation also is a very serious current issue, right? Palestinian students don't know about Jerusalem, the experience in the colonization of Jerusalem, let alone the Birzeit region, or the Galilee, or the Golan Heights, which is not Palestine, but it's a Palestinian experience, Syrian Palestinian experience. We have, instead of looking at this as an abnormality, as a foreign, as a something, the theoretical conceptions that you provide and we should work on more, we should teach these histories as belonging to one genre, and hence we can benefit from the reach the political significance of these the current significance. I think the youth, many among our youth in the university, but also in the Golan Heights. I'm also from the Golan Heights, so I'm speaking about both places. People are eager for meaning in this crazy moment in which we live. Tragic, painful moment, and crazy at the same time. And I think there's a great potential for work on this front. So I think, just praising your project and conveying some of the relevance that I thought of. I could go on also the aesthetic presentation and the way you're thinking about history, the way you're thinking about the Nakba as a multi-layered experience and multifocal experience. I'd say it's so diverse, and people should learn about its diversity, not the singularity of a single event or the monumental aspect of a certain event. This teaches us about politics, about life, about the future, about struggle. And about solidarity also. We have to be certain, we need solidarity with ourselves. If that sounds a bit awkward, maybe we can discuss it. But so this brings me to the Golan Heights. I think people, there's a certain forgetfulness about which is generational and it's normal. But what's interesting among what we see nowadays, that also youth movements or groups or initiatives, the Golan Heights is so small that we can't really talk about movements. But as a side note, for those who don't really know about the history of the Golan, we're talking about a population of 25,000 Syrians who remained in the Golan Heights after the occupation in 1967. But the vast majority of the Jolanis were expelled in 1967. Around 130,000 people were expelled. Their villages were destroyed, demolished. So we're talking about the remaining minority of a larger population. Unfortunately, we're talking only about the remaining population, not the Jolani refugees who were expelled to regions closer to Syria, to Damascus, and then who knows what happened with them, because the Syrian regime was not exactly a regime that allowed these people to express themselves politically and take on the struggle to restore their land. So we don't get into that complexity in our story, but the issue is how to relate an event that took place in a different era, in a different political atmosphere, and which seems to be passé, which seems to be completely belongs to the past, belongs to an agrarian past, because what the community did in 1982, they had a strike for 6 months. Now today, people can't strike for 6 days or maybe 6 hours because of the modernization, quote unquote, of life, because of the colonization of life. So people nowadays, what is the meaning of that event? You can't really, it's not to repeat it exactly. So what is the meaning? And I think that is the investigation of identity and the eagerness of certain young people initiating commemoration projects, eager to know about these events from a certain analytical perspective, not only the stories that are told by parents or community members, because these stories get to they're related. They relate certain feelings and experiences, but you have to, I think, provide a larger perspective. And if you connect it to people's to a notion of resilience or a notion of defiance of the state, I think this is, for me, this is a core issue. The subject which we're investigating is a community that refuses to give up to a dominating state. Before they defined it as a Zionist entity, they just saw it as an intruding governing structure, which is violent at some times, which is not violent at other times. It's very, very weird to understand. But then this is the modern state. I think in many places in the world, the state, we shouldn't give up the notion of a civil contract, the social contract concept. We should speak about the asocial contract or something of that sort. That I think there is political arrangements that emerge in the confrontation between states, governing structures, and communities and people on the ground. And these arrangements form some unwritten codes of behavior and interaction. And people struggle all the time to gain influence and power against these governing structures. They can sometimes, talk to these to officials and find middle ways and so on. But and sometimes you would feel that your identity is lost, that there's Israelization, for instance, and so forth. But the core issue is that it's not the disappearance of identity, and at certain moments in that constant confrontation with these with the governing structure, people would find it very important to go back and find roots or find foundation for political capital, right? Negative capital vis-a-vis the state that is governing you, demanding of you certain things all the time. Intruding onto your land and your environment and your education and your consciousness. So I think in that sense, I hope that our project would speak in that direction to the new generation, convey history in a way that is meaningful. I think I should stop here, and maybe we'll hear from Laura some of the questions, which I think are related basically mostly to Abid and Karma's presentation, which is totally fine.
I'm sure others will be sending in. I do encourage them. Thank you so much, Munir, and Muna, for a very insightful presentation on the archive you're creating on the Golan Heights, as well as the Karma and Abid for the Palestinian Revolution. People are really excited and they have a lot of questions. I'm just going to go into it. Maybe let's start with Abid. You can maybe comment on the Spanish language, if you're going to be providing a Spanish language resource from the Palestinian Revolution, and if you can maybe expand a little bit on the notion of the archive as an imperial notion. Someone wanted to hear more about it.
Sure, yeah. Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Carolina, for your question about the Spanish language resources. We are actually in discussion with various scholars in Latin America, particularly in the Chilean Academy and so on, about different potential avenues in that. So I think, stay tuned on that front. But Carolina, please, if you're teaching the site and you would like to talk more about it as well, we would love to have a linkage with Argentina for sure. So please email Karma or me, and we'll be happy to connect and to share with you that aspect when it comes to Latin America.
And would you like to expand on the notion I mentioned, or?
Yeah, sure, of course. I mean, if you look at how archives developed historically, there's no question that it's centralizing states, usually imperial states, that utilize them for purposes of taxation, domination, keeping records relating to governance. So there is that notion of the archive. Now, that does not mean that anti-colonial movements cannot have archives. That's not what I meant by that. But I meant that the notion of the archive, if we think about it conceptually, okay, in the same way that the notion of a museum or the notion of any cultural institution relating to something like an anti-colonial revolution or a movement cannot be a traditional notion, cannot be a still notion, and cannot fulfill purposes that are not made, do not fit the needs of the people. So it's the needs of the people that determine how we view these things. I think Karma can talk more about that, because actually I was always inspired by her vision around that, and I learned a lot from it. So maybe Karma, you wanna?
I think that covers it. I think there's so many more questions. I mean, I agree with what you said, but also what's been really interesting in the construction of this resource, both teaching and research, and thank you, Munir, it was very haunting, actually, many of your comments about the intellectual challenges and how you view this. But, you know, so many scholars, Palestinian grade political sociologists like Shamir Halal, Bayan al-Hout, you know, different types, going through what does oral history give us, what do archives give us and don't give us, what do they exclude? Yeah, so I think it's always the balance of those things to be aware of both of those traditions, right? So I think Munir was talking about a tradition where people can find themselves now that is very rich and very, very strong in the Palestinian case globally, but also where, because of the predicament people find themselves in, where history is being erased on purpose, that the tradition that they come from, if they want to find a path, needs to be made accessible to them. And of course, young people have different questions than the older members of our very long movement. Yeah. So, but I think Abed, you covered that well.
Okay. I'll ask this question to all of you, actually, because I think everyone can answer this. It's the idea of access. So archives are really important, but how can we utilize more access on the local and communal level to build interest in archives like the Palestinian Revolution and mapping memories when people might not be aware of it? Muna, maybe you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Definitely. I think this is also a question that we've been grappling with in the project, really thinking about you know, providing this platform with rich material, mainly collected, as I said, like through decades of, you know, collective work on the ground by the Jolanis themselves. Others, you know, from, you know, these state archives, like the Israeli state archives and others, that, of course, as we mentioned, we have to be very critical, because as like personally, just looking through a lot of archives for my work, for my PhD, and just realizing that, of course, you know, you cannot take it as face value. For instance, on the Golan Heights, everything that you can find is based on like geostrategic importance of the Golan Heights. Of course, nothing really, you know, allows you to understand, you know, the everyday actions, and even those were distorted completely to show that. So, for instance, on water, I looked at a lot of, you know, community-led projects in the 1980s that were happening even under the curfew and you know, the strike. But how, you know, how the Israeli army actually narrated those events was very different than how the people narrated it on the ground. So I think definitely that critical lens is really important when you know, approaching these archives. And yeah, sometimes maybe they're better to be avoided in a lot of cases, because there's a lot of deconstruction and exposure of, you know, settler colonial logic and mindset that needs to happen there. On making sure that it's accessible, coming back to that question, I think that is really a challenge, to be honest, because again, as a Palestinian researcher, my knowledge of the Golan Heights actually was very minimal before engaging with projects, research project there, and later on my PhD. But that is a very important point, is how do we actually get, there is interest in knowledge, but how do we make it accessible? How do we make sure that make it also available to wider audiences? And what we're doing with our platform and the database is trying to really allow for different medium to be used. So whether it's video, you know, lots of visual materials, audio files, making sure also to have a strategy for how to also dissipate this information and disseminate it, maybe through, you know, social media, and trying to make sure that, you know, that is not a barrier for people to access it. Another thing is we're doing, which also, your project is doing is basically allowing it to be in multiple languages, basically first to start with bilingual, but maybe also if there was interest, like we saw in Argentina, it would be also nice to start, producing knowledge in multiple languages, and make sure to be aware that a lot of, I saw in the chat, a lot of Palestinian communities are spread out around the world. Jawlani communities as well, they've also spread out now across different regions. So it would be nice, also important to keep note of that and make sure that we don't fall into that trap of producing knowledge for that small group of usual audiences. So yeah, that's.
Yeah, Laura, I think one additional point, I mean, I really enjoy the way that Mona and Munir view their project. And I would add another thing which fits in with this vision, which is that we need to really work hard in the Palestinian sphere on challenging the possessive individualist model that the Western academy, but also university structures worldwide impose on people. Those structures are not made for liberation, okay? They're made for thinking about how to develop a career or how to push a research agenda. It's a very individual model, the humanities research model in general. So one thing about colonized and occupied peoples and movements is that they cannot depend on those models. So this is why also, when we talk of challenging the notion of an archive, when you assert, I have the archive, it's an assertion of centralization, it's an assertion of possession in a way. Whereas instead, the archive in its multiple forms, we're all of these projects are part of building the archive, if we want to say, but it's the multiplicity of projects and the different initiatives and in the accessibility of these initiatives to the people that will help us overturn this individual model, use collective models that help further our struggles. And it's not easy. It's easier said than done because, for example, when you engage in projects like these, they take a lot of time. They're usually not recognized in the same way by traditional academic recognition standards, yeah? Like, 10-year promotion, whatever. They usually look at books or articles or there are, some attempts to look at digital humanities these days to integrate them, but it's still shaky. And the digital humanities model usually can also be susceptible to these individualist models and competitive models. So what I think is beautiful about this session and what I'm enjoying is that I'm seeing how we can broaden knowledge, we can provide platforms for sharing, platforms for engaging with these important questions in different ways. And I really hope that Palestine will provide a very nice starting point for engaging with other anti-colonial struggles actually in this regard. I know that Karma knows this. We get a lot of emails and we get a lot of interest actually from other parts of the colonized world now on, okay, how do we do a website of this kind? How do we, because we've worked, for example, very closely with the South Africans. What they've done was a very hefty set of volumes, for example. That was the approach. But now the real challenge for them is to how to disseminate. And projects like this, the use of digital technologies like that, the accessibility, can provide a very good Palestinian model on how to deal with that.
That's a really good point. And I think something else that is important to also ask for both projects is protecting the information that you have. So have you faced any problems, whether in the Palestinian Revolution or mapping memories, in protecting sensitive information? How do you protect documents before you digitize them? Were there any challenges in that sort of process?
I just said that's exactly a kind of 8-hour session that we just really don't need. Everybody can imagine, you know, the Palestinian predicament is just extraordinary in the capacities it requires of all of us, and a great educative dilemma for many of us to have. I just want to add one more thing to what everybody has been talking about dissemination, Mona and Abid and Munir, and accessibility and the purposes of the collecting itself. You know, we haven't even started our proper dissemination of this work through the universities and through the inside Palestine. I've been really ill over the last few months, so we just delayed a lot of things. But what happened is someone did a little bit of it in Arabic. We haven't done the Arabic yet. I think one article, I think a friend of Abid's or a friend of, and actually it just went around in a kind of not forcefully disseminated way. And we received, it's something very interesting that happened, because this is a subject that is not talked about between the generations. And every member of the younger generation will know how many times they've asked their uncle, their grandparent, their father, and there's a silence. As soon as they ask about the revolution, there's a silence. It's very, very difficult to talk about or to find a language for this collective experience, yeah, for the older, and very painful. And that this, we received so many messages from people that this came in a very intimate way into people's homes. And because it's a national history, but it's a huge set of decades there to have been silenced in a way. And there was a way that many people talked about, they were having conversations just by playing some of the videos, by talking about it, that it began conversations which really need to be had, because our young generation obviously have a lot of work to do. And the more informed they are about the people and the generation before, the better. You know, lots of options, lots of possibilities, etc. But I found that very interesting without a dissemination that was designed in a particular way, because there's many levels, a civic way, an academic way, you know, in host institutions way to embed it and to give it some length of time, some stability. This was actually something very lovely and very important.
Thank you for that. Does anyone want to add anything to that?
I would say also it's beyond the dissemination part. There's also the question of method and how to deal with the sources and how to gather them, especially when you're doing Kedar history. And actually, I'm thinking here of somebody who's helped organize this session, but is kind of a secret soldier in it. Maysoon Sukkariya's work, like when she's studying how people do the opposite, over-research the communities, impose like an imperial agenda on them, gather information for the sake of careers without any due concern for how it's utilized. We as scholars engaging in developing an anti-colonial outlook, an anti-colonial epistemology that is very rigorous, but at the same time very attentive to the needs of our communities, should be aware of the dynamics of research in a certain way. And that's something that we were trying to work really hard on, especially when it came to the oral history, but also when it came to personal collections and things of that sort. It's very important to talk to people in a respectful way, but also to try to open up different conversations that touch upon aspects of memory that are actually suppressed. And this was maybe the hardest element of this, because this is not just about people going, of course, as Kama said, there's a lot of silence around it between generations, but there are also tropes around it to develop. And there's a kind of a general story that is told that absorbs a lot of the regime stories, that absorbs a lot of self-flagellation, that absorbs a lot of different narratives that come out of cultures of defeat as well, you know, that come out of the Oslo moment, that come out of the Tatbiya moment that we're seeing now, that come out of bitterness and pain. And what you're trying to do with something like this, and this is actually one of the most beautiful experiences that both Karma and I have had, is when you open a different layer and you start talking to people about how they felt and experienced events at the time. It takes the weight that they feel they have to impose on themselves, you know, off their shoulders. They can suddenly, if you say, look, there's a different way of thinking about this. How about you forget about the analysis part, all the, you know, stuff that you have to do now that you feel like you have to say, you know, that we made mistakes and we did this and we did that. And forget also about both heroic narratives that you sometimes have to have a pressure to tell the individual, but also the negative and teleological narratives that are connected to the moment, and just tell it as if you're sitting with your grandkids, but actually without feeling to justify or negate anything. And that kind of way of doing research opens up a different relationship between the Palestinian students and their parents and the Palestinian researchers and the communities they're trying to serve. So, and people can tell if your concern is actually doing a community service with this, doing an anti-colonial service with this. Because you'd end up developing it with them. That's what Karma actually mentioned earlier, that caterers were involved in developing this. And that's really important because we've had decades of ignoring caterers. You know, unlike these big established European states, for example. And I remember, you know, when we organized the workshops, Karma might recall, we brought scholars of France who, you know, remembering that, you know, there were a few years of Nazi occupation of France, maybe, you know, and the Vichy government and so on. But those few years were so heavily investigated. Every French village had millions of euros spent on it to interview everybody who's ever lived under that. And all the veterans are respected and paraded and given recognition for like decades. We have the opposite situation. We have people who fought for a long, long period of time, decades, not 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years. They spent like 10, 20, 30 years, 40 years of their lives. It stayed with them. They were imprisoned in multiple phases. They've lost family. They've been dispersed across the world. And we all know this. Everybody on this panel has had this touch them in a certain way. Everybody listening probably has had this touch them in a certain way. But there's nobody there to celebrate them. There's nobody there to talk about them. And that can have a deep impact on the psychology of our communities. You know, now, with a project like this, this is not a state. This is not about giving celebrations. This is not about building a certain tradition, but it's actually about saying, your story matters. Our people want to hear it. Our people need to hear it because their history is erased on a regular basis. And the biggest history that is erased is actually the resistance history. So even with the Nakba, when we spoke about the Nakba in this website, we were actually trying to convey to the students the depth of organizing to counter the Nakba on the local level in each one of these regions. Not many people know how many villages had local committees, local defense committees, how many organized their own supply lines, how many of them raised all sorts of initiatives. And this is an incredible story at every level. So to tap into that to try to restore some of the dignity into that and to engage in this kind of research in this kind of way is beautiful. And I think we have to keep it going like that.
Thank you so much, Abid. We are sort of ran out of time, but I do want to ask one more question specific to the Golan Heights project, because it is an untold story, and the Syrian history is part of the Palestinian history. And I would like to hear your comments, Muna or Munir, specifically about the Israeli archives that tell the narrative of that specific story, or the story of the Palestinians and the Syrians in the conflict, and how does your project sort of fight that or presented the narrative that we know as one of the first? It's an untold story. Maybe if you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, okay. Muna, would you like? Or
no, go ahead. I have a few things to say.
I mean, well, the Israeli archive hasn't, strictly speaking, as an archive, hasn't released a lot of documents on this issue yet. But we have lots of publications, and the media discourse, the political discourse, and the media discourse is clear. It's not hidden in archives. I don't know I'm sure there are always secret stuff in archives that are very important to discover at a certain point, or I think the two key events are important here. One is the occupation in 1967, which is Israel denies basically the narrative of expulsion. So there's no official recognition of this. When the Israelis deal with this, they deal with it as part of their own war trauma, not as part of ethnic cleansing of the Syrians, and taking responsibility and so forth. So there's a narrative confrontation right away here. In 1982. The Israelis profile us as a crazy community that refused the reason, refused to acknowledge the fact that we live in a better modernized state in comparison to the backward Syria. And this story is current. It's told to us every day, 40 years, 50 years now, after more than 50 years of occupation. So for me, how you relate to this, I think Muna mentioned a very, very, very important term, which is anti-colonial struggles or defiance of the state or revolutions. Call them any term. They are structures. They're not processes. They're not simply transition periods into a state or a certain solution. I think if we hold into this understanding, we can sense the relevance of knowing the history and the details. It's not simply the repetition of what happened. It's basically extracting the meaning, the political meaning of what happened. And I think our community, like the Palestinian communities and many other communities in the world, need this power to confront crazy demands by governing structures. Whether it's the capital, whether it's the companies that seek to exploit your land and your air and your environment, or ideological regimes that demand certain things of you that are not you. Basically, they want to force you to play roles that you defy, you don't want. At the same time, you, like anyone in the world, you want a better life. So I think the dynamics of this are very, very important to understand, because the state colonizes people, but people also defy the conceptual schemes of the state, and they look as things, as certain opportunities, as they destructure the state, deconstruct the state in their daily practice. So there's no, I think that there's no way of healing this fracture. We should embrace that this is an ongoing condition, and it's not on the periphery of the world. It's at the heart of the world, because the vast majority of the world, of the people in the world, are governed not exactly according to their wills. So this is a political message that is relevant to many people around. It's not simply to a community that is isolated, that its homeland has been destroyed, its people have been expelled. I mean, think about the Syrian Nakba today is heartbreaking. It's much, much bigger than we could ever imagine. So the meaning of national identity is not simply to have a structure of a state. It's a spirit of seeking, fighting for your freedom in whichever form you can achieve it. So in that sense, I think archiving, archives and authority are connected, as Abid said. But if you think about people's practices as a structure, as a productive of certain political will and action and facts on the ground, then it's basically an authority. So popular authority produces its archive, its memory, and when we should utilize critical methodologies to collect to understand this memory. And if I get something, when Abd was talking, I was thinking about this borrowing of historical critical methodology, and as experts in this, as trained people in this methodology, we can basically play a role of disseminating the methodology to people to question their parents or their peers, or more than conveying knowledge, because these stories it's a wide set of stories all the time, everywhere. Everyone has a story, so I think it's very useful. We can work. Maybe our usefulness is in training people outside of the university disciplines, and not for grades, but for understanding the past. So in that sense, I hope we can contribute in that direction. So yeah, thanks. I should stop here, but I don't know if we get over.
Thank you so
time.
much.
Actually, people are still with us, so I'm on Facebook and Zoom, so it is very interesting. Muna, I want you to, if you can.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Munir is saying, and just really, I think just getting engaged in such projects, I think what is really humbling and really exciting at the same time is, the potential, of just providing a platform where things can start to be exposed, where people start to engage in conversation, in debates about, these like critical questions of identity, belonging, and kind of the past and events of the past and how they affect their current condition. And I think that's definitely something we have seen in our project, kind of the need for the young generation to actually reclaim those memories and reclaim those events and shape them and use them to shape their future. And I think the Golan Heights is a case in point of, that really active engagement where the young generation now is bringing, these tactics and strategies of the 1980s acts of resistance, and reappropriating them, changing them, adapting them to fit their own ideas and strategies. And there is this youth mobilization that addresses issues of forced elections, to the energy, green energy, and the wind turbines projects that come to take over, you know, people's livelihood and lands, and they're like kind of looking at tactics, always looking back at what happened in the 1980s, learning from it, changing, adapting, and moving on. And I think we've had a lot of interesting, you know, discussions with the Jawlani youth we work with, and it's really so exciting to see potentials where we can start, you know, archiving and documenting those interactions and those dynamics that are really very, very much needed. And kind of that, in a way, decolonizes our knowledge production in a way that it doesn't have to be a certain box that you have to fit in order to produce knowledge. It can be something that comes really from the needs of the people, from their aspirations and the meanings they give to events, to places, to dynamics. And this is where we can grow and use, you know, contemporary tools and methods to do that. And just one point, on curriculum as well, is what we're trying to do is make this curriculum open, and also kind of very intersectional in a way where we learn about other struggles, especially around, you know, control and access to natural resources, and indigenous communities struggle to belong and remain on the land. And so also to open our horizons to understand that a lot of mobilization and synergies can happen there. And I want to commend on Dr. Ammar Tasdel, who is also a partner with us on the project, who is developing this curriculum. And we're really excited about it because when we thought about what could be, you know, what we could do in providing that platforms and just opening it up, going back to the communities and, you know, just, you know, allowing, you know, just giving the infrastructure and allowing that infrastructure to be used as they see fit. And this is what we're hoping to achieve with the archive. So I think it's far away from kind of this archiving concept that kind of is the traditional one, but we're thinking kind of I don't want to use too much the decolonizing archives, but it is in a way kind of liberating us from the shackles of that archive and that control, but opening up for multiple viewpoints, multiple meanings and worldviews.
Thank you so much, Muna, for that, and thank you all actually for a very, very interesting webinar. A lot of people have been sending in emails and tweets and a lot of questions, and we'll try to sort of bring in all possible collaborations with you. I really appreciate your time, and IPS appreciates your time. This webinar is recorded and will be available on YouTube. If you have further questions, I put in my email in the chat, so you can just do that. And we're done, so thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for your help.
Making it happen.
And to all the speakers also in my capacity as an IPS person. So thank you very much. And see you soon.
It's been a pleasure.
Bye.